The conference room on the 42nd floor of Ashworth Capitol had floor-to-ceiling windows that looked out over downtown Chicago like a postcard someone designed to make you feel small. I'd been sitting in the same chair for 30 minutes. The one they'd put me in near the door, away from the main table, the kind of seat you give someone when you want them to understand they don't belong. My son's father-in-law had arranged it that way. I knew that before I even walked in. I was wearing my green Carhartt jacket, the one with the frayed cuffs I'd been meaning to replace for 2 years. Khaki pants I'd ironed that morning in my apartment. Brown shoes my late wife had bought me for our 35th anniversary dinner, still holding up after 11 years. I looked exactly like what they thought I was. A retired factory supervisor from Rockford, Illinois, who drove a 2008 Ford F-150 and clipped grocery coupons on Sunday mornings. The room was filling up. Lawyers in tailored suits. Financial advisors with leather portfolios. My daughter-in-law sat at the far end of the table in a cream blazer, not looking at me. My son sat beside her, his face tight, his hands flat on the table the way he did when he was trying not to say something. His father-in-law sat at the head of the table, Gerald Ashworth, 70 years old, silver hair, a Rolex that cost more than my truck. He ran the kind of private equity firm that showed up in business magazines with headlines like Visionary and Industry Titan. He'd been very kind to my son when the marriage first happened. Generous, attentive, the sort of man who makes you feel grateful right up until the moment he wants something from you. He glanced at me once when I came in, one of those glances that lasted just long enough to take a measurement. Then he looked away. His attorney, a woman named Patricia Boyle, was standing at a whiteboard running through a presentation about what she was calling a restructuring proposal. 92 slides, I'd counted. She had the smooth efficiency of someone who delivered bad news in pleasant language so many times that the two things had become indistinguishable in her mind. What she was describing, in careful corporate language, was this. Gerald Ashworth intended to acquire controlling interest in my son's company, a logistics software firm called Meridian Systems that my son had spent 7 years building from a spare bedroom in their first house. The deal was structured so that my son would retain his title but lose his voting power. He would become an employee inside the company he'd created. His father-in-law would own it. My son had called me 2 nights ago, his voice the way it used to sound when he was 14 and something had gone very wrong, but he didn't want to admit it. Dad, I think I made a mistake. I didn't tell him what I already knew. Not yet. Patricia Boyle clicked to a new slide. The final piece of the restructuring requires ratification from all existing shareholders of record. That includes, she paused, checking her notes, minority stakeholders. She looked toward me with the polite smile people use on the elderly and the confused. Which brings us to you, Mr. Calloway. My son turned to me with a look I hadn't seen since he was a boy. Part hope, part apology. Gerald Ashworth leaned back in his chair and interlaced his fingers. He wasn't concerned. He'd done his research on me, or thought he had. Frank, Gerald said, his voice warm and deliberate. I want you to know we appreciate you making the trip down from Rockford. I know it's a long drive. 3 hours, I said. Good weather today. Good. Good. He nodded like I'd said something charming. I'll be direct with you. What we're proposing is the best possible outcome for David and for this company. We have the capital to scale Meridian in ways that simply aren't possible at its current size. Your son will be financially secure for the rest of his life. His children will be financially secure. He spread his hands on the table. All we need is your signature on the transfer documents. My daughter-in-law looked at her water glass. One of the attorneys, a young man with rectangular glasses, opened a folder in front of him. Mr. Calloway, the shares you hold represent a 4.3% stake in Meridian Systems. At the proposed acquisition price, that would net you approximately $280,000. That's a significant return on your original investment. He said original investment with just enough delicacy to make clear he considered it a modest sum that a man like me should feel lucky to have stumbled into. Someone at the table, I didn't catch who, laughed softly. The kind of laugh you make when the number isn't impressive enough to be serious. My son closed his eyes for a moment. I put my hands flat on the table. Before we proceed, I said, "Would it be all right if I asked a few questions?" Gerald waved his hand generously. "Of course. Thank you." I looked at Patricia Boyle. "Would you mind pulling up slide 67? She blinked. "I'm sorry?" "Slide 67. The one with the capital flow projections from the feeder accounts in Delaware." The room went very quiet. Gerald Ashworth's expression didn't change, but something happened behind his eyes. A door closing, a calculation beginning. Patricia Boyle looked at her client. He gave her nothing. She looked back at me. "Mr. Calloway, I'm not sure what you're referring to." "That's all right," I said. "Let me be more specific." I reached into the inside pocket of my Carhartt jacket and placed a single sheet of paper on the table. Then another. Then a third. "I'd like to enter these into the record," I said. "Before we sign anything." My son's father-in-law leaned forward to look, and I watched his face do something I'd been waiting 7 months to see. "Let me take you back to where this actually started. I spent 31 years working for the federal government, not in a factory, not on an assembly line. I was a financial examiner with the Securities and Exchange Commission, assigned to the Midwest Regional Office in Chicago for the last 19 of those years. Before I retired, I ran a 12-person team that investigated market manipulation, securities fraud, and insider trading. We put 34 people in federal prison. I attended all 34 sentencing hearings. I shook hands with the prosecutors afterward each time. I retired in 2019 at 61. My wife passed from pancreatic cancer 8 months later. Her name was Ruth. 38 years. She was the reason I kept that job as long as I did, because she used to say that honest work was the only kind worth doing, and that the world needed more people willing to do the quiet, unglamorous, absolutely essential work of making sure the rules meant something. After Ruth died, I moved back to Rockford, where we'd grown up. I drove my truck. I fixed things around the house. I planted a garden in the backyard and discovered, to my genuine surprise, that I was good at it. My neighbors knew me as the widower on Elm Street who kept his yard neat and brought zucchini to the block party in August. Nobody knew what I used to do. I didn't talk about it. It wasn't modesty. It was just that, when I was working, that identity had filled every room I walked into. After Ruth died, I didn't need it to anymore. I was just Frank. My son had never advertised my background either. We're not a family that leads with credentials. My son built Meridian with his own hands, his own vision, and I was proud of him for it. When he asked me 4 years ago if I wanted to invest some of my retirement savings in the company, I did. Not a large amount by Gerald Ashworth standards. But I'd watched my son build something real, and I believed in it. What I hadn't anticipated was Gerald. My daughter-in-law was a good woman. She loved my son. She loved my grandchildren. None of what happened was her fault, and I want to be clear about that. But her father was a man who saw everything in terms of position, and when his daughter married a young entrepreneur with a promising software company, Gerald Ashworth filed that information away in the part of his brain reserved for assets and opportunities. I noticed the first signs about 2 years into the marriage. Dinners where Gerald would steer the conversation toward Meridian's growth projections, comments about bringing in experienced capital, offers to connect David with some people. My son was young enough and optimistic enough to read it as generosity. I read it as reconnaissance. I kept my mouth shut. You can't tell a young man in love that his father-in-law is conducting a quiet audit of his life's work. And I didn't have evidence. I had instinct, and 31 years of professional instinct, but still, instinct isn't something you can put on the table. What changed was the audit. 18 months ago, Gerald hired an outside firm to conduct what he described as a standard due diligence review of Meridian systems. He framed it as preparation for a potential Series B investment. My son agreed. Why wouldn't he? His father-in-law was offering to bring in money. What the audit actually did was map every vulnerability in Meridian's capitalization structure. And once Gerald had that map, he started moving. The first move was recruiting my son's CFO, not hiring him away, which would have been obvious, but cultivating him. Dinners. Introductions to Gerald's network. A quiet side arrangement I found out about later. The second move was the debt. Gerald extended what he called a bridge loan to Meridian during a tight quarter, at favorable terms, with a conversion clause buried in paragraph 14 of the agreement that allowed him to convert the debt to equity under certain conditions. My son had a lawyer review it. The lawyer missed paragraph 14. These things happen. The third move was patience. Gerald waited. He let the clause sit there like a trap with no bait. He waited until interest rates shifted and Meridian had an expensive quarter, and then he quietly triggered the conversion. By the time my son called me 2 nights before that boardroom meeting, Gerald Ashworth had accumulated enough convertible instruments and friendly proxy arrangements to force the restructuring. All he needed was my 4.3%. Without it, the vote was technically short of the threshold required under Meridian's shareholder agreement. I was the last door. "Dad," my son had said on the phone, "his lawyer says if I don't agree to the restructuring, he'll use the debt conversion to force a board vote. And he's got the votes. He says the only clean option is to sign. He says I'll still run the company. Don't sign anything until I get there," I said. "Dad, it's a 3-hour drive. I'll leave at 6 in the morning." There was a long pause. "You don't have to do this." "I know I don't have to." I looked at my kitchen window, at the garden Ruth never got to see. "Do you trust me?" Another pause. Shorter. "Yes." "Then don't sign anything." What my son didn't know, and what Gerald Ashworth definitely didn't know, was that I had spent the previous 7 months doing what I used to do for a living. It started with that bridge loan. Something about the structure bothered me. I'd seen similar arrangements in 3 different cases during my years at the SEC, and 2 of those 3 had involved undisclosed conflicts of interest. So I started looking. Not officially. I was retired. I had no authority, no badge, no subpoena power. What I had was 31 years of knowing where to look and what to look for. I have a small home office. I have a computer. I have subscriptions to several financial databases I've maintained since retirement because I like to stay current. I have former colleagues who owe me favors and trust my judgment. And I have time. The public records took me 3 months. Corporate filings in Delaware, Nevada, and Wyoming. Registered agents with overlapping addresses. Shell companies that existed on paper and nowhere else. 6 of them, connected to each other in a configuration I recognize the way a plumber recognizes when someone has rerouted their pipes. Gerald Ashworth wasn't just a private equity investor. He was moving money. Not drug money, not arms money. Gerald was too careful and too vain for that kind of exposure. What Gerald was doing was cleaner and, in some ways, more arrogant. He was using his investment vehicles to facilitate undisclosed transactions for a network of clients who needed assets to appear somewhere other than where they actually were. Wealthy clients, political clients. The kind of clients who paid for that service very generously and expected absolute discretion in return. Meridian Systems, with its logistics software and its clean balance sheet, was meant to be one of the vehicles. Once Gerald controlled it, certain transactions could be routed through its accounts, papered over as software licensing fees, and emerge on the other end looking like legitimate revenue. Small percentages. Nothing that would trigger automatic flags. The kind of arrangement that runs quietly for years if nobody pulls the right thread. I pulled the thread. In February, I contacted an old colleague of mine from the Chicago regional office. Retired 2 years before me, still sharp, still connected. We met at a diner in Oak Park, the kind of place with coffee that comes in a ceramic mug and nobody asks why you've been sitting there for 2 hours. I put a folder on the table. He read it without speaking for 45 minutes. "Frank," he said finally, "this is solid. I know. If you'd brought this to me with a badge, I'd have had agents on it yesterday. I know that too." He looked up. "This is about your son. This is about the truth," I said. "But yes, also my son." He was quiet for a moment. "You know that complicates things. Personal interest. The defense will use it. The documentation stands on its own." I didn't manufacture anything. Every record in that folder is a public filing or a document I obtained through legal means. You can verify every single page independently. My name doesn't have to be attached to a single one. He closed the folder. What do you need? I need this to land at the right time. Not before the shareholder meeting. Add it. I need Gerald Ashworth in a room believing he's already won. He studied me the way people study something they're not sure is real. Then he nodded slowly. You always were the most patient person in any building you walked into. Ruth used to call it stubbornness. Probably both. I'll skip over the next 4 months in detail, except to say this. By the time I drove to Chicago on that Tuesday morning, what had been my folder of findings had become a formal referral to the SEC's Enforcement Division and a parallel matter with the U.S. Attorney's Office. The documentation had been verified independently. Warrants had been prepared. The timing had been coordinated. My contact had arranged one thing I had specifically requested, that the action happen in the room, not in the parking garage, not at Gerald's home. In the room, after he'd had his moment, after he'd let everyone see exactly who he thought he was. I needed that on the record. My son didn't know any of this. I couldn't tell him. If Gerald sensed anything had changed, he might have moved the meeting, and the timing of the enforcement action would have collapsed. My son would have thought I'd come to Rockford with nothing but an old jacket and stubbornness, and he would have been half right. Back in the conference room, Patricia Boyle was looking at the papers I'd placed on the table. Gerald Ashworth hadn't moved. He was very good at not moving. In 31 years, I'd sat across from a lot of men like him. They all had the same quality, a kind of enforced stillness in moments of threat, like animals that go quiet when they sense something wrong but haven't identified it yet. Mr. Calloway, he said, his voice still level, I'm not sure what you think those documents. The first one, I said, is a summary of capital transfers between Ashworth Capital's Delaware holding entity and 3 shell companies registered in Wyoming between 2021 and 2023. The second is a record of corresponding transactions routed through a subsidiary operating account that was opened 9 months before you extended the bridge loan to Meridian. I looked at him directly. The third is a letter from the Securities and Exchange Commission Enforcement Division confirming receipt of a referral in this matter. My son was staring at me. My daughter-in-law had gone very pale. Patricia Boyle stood up. Mr. Calloway, I don't know what you've been told, but making unsubstantiated allegations they're substantiated. I kept my voice the way I'd learned to keep it in 31 years of interviews with people who were very frightened and very angry. Quiet. Even. Every document in that packet has been independently verified by federal examiners. The referral was submitted 6 weeks ago. The timing of this meeting was coordinated with enforcement staff. Gerald Ashworth's jaw tightened. It was the first real crack, just the jaw. Everything else stayed composed. Who are you? He said. I hadn't used the title in 5 years. I'd thought about whether to say it. I'd decided yes. Not for vanity. For the record. For the moment my son would read the transcript of this meeting sometime later and understand exactly what had happened. My name is Frank Calloway. I was a senior financial examiner with the Securities and Exchange Commission, Chicago Regional Office, for 19 years. Prior to that, 12 years in the Enforcement Division in Washington. I folded my hands on the table. I know what I'm looking at, Gerald. I have known for 7 months. The side door opened. 2 people entered the conference room. Both in dark clothing, both moving with the practiced directness of people who do this regularly. One was a woman I recognized from the U.S. Attorney's Office. The other was a federal agent I'd spoken to by phone but not yet met in person. Gerald Ashworth looked at them, then he looked at me. I don't know exactly what he saw in my face. Whatever it was enough. Mr. Ashworth, the woman from the U.S. Attorney's Office said, we have a warrant for your arrest on charges of securities fraud, wire fraud, and conspiracy. You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law." The room was absolutely silent. Then Patricia Boyle said, "This is completely irregular. We're in the middle of a legal proceeding," and she stopped when the federal agent looked at her with an expression that conveyed, without any words at all, that this was not a conversation she wanted to start. My daughter-in-law made a sound I won't describe. She stood up. She looked at her father. She looked at my son. She sat back down. Gerald Ashworth didn't say a word when they put the handcuffs on. He was looking at me the entire time, and I think he was trying to understand how a man in a Carhartt jacket had done this to him. The answer was simple. He'd made the same mistake that people in his position always make. He thought that what a person appeared to be and what a person actually was were the same thing. They let him out. Patricia Boyle gathered her papers with the mechanical efficiency of someone switching into self-protection mode. She was out of the room in 90 seconds. The other attorneys followed. For a moment it was just my son, my daughter-in-law, and me. My son looked at me for a long time. He was 51 years old. I'd watched him take his first steps on a linoleum kitchen floor in our first house. I'd watched him graduate college, start a business, get married, become a father. I had never in his adult life seen his face look the way it looked at that moment. Like a door had opened that he hadn't known was there. "Dad," he said. "Yeah. How long have you known?" "That something was wrong? About 2 years. That I could prove it? 7 months. He put his hands over his face, took a breath, put them back down. "You drove 3 hours in that jacket. The jacket is fine. You sat there and let him talk to you like you were. It doesn't matter how he talked to me. It matters to me." I looked at my son. "I know. But what matters more is that Meridian is yours. It's going to stay yours." I paused. "The bridge loan will be unwound as part of the investigation. Your CFO will be a separate matter, but you'll have documentation to act on. You should get a good attorney this week, not one from Patricia Boyle's firm." My son laughed. It wasn't a happy laugh exactly, but it was real. "Yeah, I'll get right on that." My daughter-in-law hadn't said anything. She was looking at the table. She was a good woman, and this was a terrible day for her, and none of it was her doing. "I'm sorry," I told her. "I know this isn't what you wanted." She looked up. Her eyes were red. "Did you know from the beginning? When he and I first got married?" "No. I had a feeling your father was ambitious. That's different from knowing." "When did you know for certain?" "When I saw the Wyoming filings. I said it plainly. There was no use in softening the timeline. She deserved the truth. About 7 months ago." She nodded slowly. There was a particular kind of grief in her face. The grief of someone who is losing an image they'd held of someone they loved. I recognized it. I'd seen it in many families over the years, in living rooms and conference rooms and courtrooms, the moment when the person you believed someone was becomes someone you have to rearrange your entire past to accommodate. "Will he go to prison?" she asked. "That depends on the case they build and the choices he makes, but the evidence is significant." She stood up quietly, picked up her bag, and left the room. My son watched her go. I knew that marriage was going to go through something very hard, and I didn't know what would come out the other side. That wasn't mine to determine. My son and I rode the elevator down to the lobby together. We walked out into the cold Chicago air on a Tuesday afternoon in November. I had the collar of my jacket up. The city was loud and gray and indifferent the way Chicago always is when you're the only one who knows what just happened. "Did Mom know?" my son asked. "About what you used to do?" She knew everything. She was the only person who always did. He was quiet for a half a block. "I wish she were here." "Me too." She would have said something very calm and very correct about all of this. She would have told you to call a good attorney, and then she would have made soup. My son smiled. "Yeah, that's exactly what she would have done." We walked to where my truck was parked, 2 blocks from the building, in a pay lot that charged $14 for the first hour. My son looked at the truck the way he always did, like he was waiting for it to finally give up. It wouldn't. I'd rebuilt the engine myself 3 years ago. "I need to ask you something," he said. "Ask. Why didn't you tell me?" "While it was happening." Why did you let me walk into that room thinking I might lose everything? You could have called me last week, last month, because you would have confronted him, and if you'd confronted him before the warrant was ready, he would have moved assets and the case would have been harder to make, maybe impossible. So you let me worry. I let you trust me. I looked at my son directly. I told you 2 nights ago, don't sign anything and do you trust me? You said yes. He was quiet. I've never given you a reason not to, I said. In 51 years. No, he said. You haven't. He put his hand out. I shook it, and then he pulled me in and held on for a moment, the way he hadn't since he was a teenager, and his mother had gone to the hospital the first time for a scare that turned out to be nothing. When he stepped back, he was composed, but barely. Get in the car, I told him. Call your lawyer. I'll be in Rockford by 6. I drove home on I-90 with the windows down enough to hear the road. The adrenaline fades differently when you're 63 than when you were 40. It leaves slower, like heat leaving a stone. The fields on either side of the highway went gray as the afternoon went flat. I stopped once for coffee at a place called Betty's outside of Rockton. The woman behind the counter had a name tag that said Diane, and she said, "Cold one today, hun," and refilled my cup without me asking. I sat there for a few minutes longer than I needed to. Ruth had a saying she'd gotten from her father, who'd gotten it from his. You can't always choose the fight. You can choose how you fight it. She said it when I was working the cases that kept me at the office until midnight, the ones that felt like trying to hold water in my hands, the ones where I wasn't sure the evidence would hold, where I lay awake running the same threads through my mind over and over. She said it plainly, without drama, the way she said most important things. I'd spent 7 months being a retired man who drove a truck and planted tomatoes and had a frayed jacket he kept meaning to replace. 7 months of letting the world see exactly what it expected to see, not because I enjoyed it, because it was what the situation required, because patience and precision had always been my actual strengths, the ones nobody could see, the ones that didn't fit on a business card or in a conference room presentation. Gerald Ashworth had looked at my jacket and seen the whole story of who I was. He'd told himself a simple version of a complicated person and decided it was sufficient. It wasn't. The trial took 14 months. Gerald Ashworth's attorneys were expensive and creative, and they filed motions the way people clear brush, constantly, hoping to slow enough to discourage. It didn't work. The documentary evidence was what it was. 11 former clients cooperated with prosecutors. The Wyoming Shell Company filings alone were enough for 3 of the counts. He was convicted on 9 counts of securities fraud, 4 counts of wire fraud, and 2 counts of conspiracy to obstruct regulatory examination. The judge sentenced him to 11 years. He was 63 years old, same as me. My daughter-in-law sat in the gallery for the verdict. She came alone. When they read the sentence, she didn't react. She sat very still with her hands in her lap and looked at the man who had raised her, who had provided for her, who had bought her the things she'd believed were evidence of his love, and she sat with whatever that experience was. I don't know what it felt like. I didn't ask. Some things belong only to the person living them. My son's marriage survived. I won't say it was easy. It wasn't. My four, 4 zil, my 4, but they were honest with each other in a way that the year of that trial required them to be, and on the other side of it, they were still standing. Their daughter, my granddaughter, who was 9 at the time all of this happened, started high school last fall. She made the cross-country team. She runs like she's trying to get somewhere specific. Meridian Systems went on to close a legitimate Series B 18 months after the trial with investors who'd read about the case and respected what my son had built. He still runs it. He sent me a framed copy of the term sheet with a note taped to the back that said, "Glad you drove 3 hours in that jacket." I've got it on the wall in my home office, next to a photograph of Ruth in the garden the summer before she got sick, laughing at something I'd said that I can't remember anymore, her whole face lit up, squinting into the sun. I still drive the same truck, still plant the garden in spring, still clip coupons on Sunday mornings, not because I have to, but because Ruth and I started doing it together 40 years ago, and I'm not ready to stop. My neighbors still know me as the widower on Elm Street who keeps his yard neat and brings zucchini to the block party in August. That's enough. A few months after the trial ended, my son called me on a Thursday evening. He'd been talking to his daughter, my granddaughter, and she'd apparently asked why Grandpa never seemed worried about anything. "What did you tell her?" I asked. "I told her you were the most prepared, unprepared-looking person I've ever known." I laughed. "That's not wrong. Dad." He paused. "She wants to know if you'll teach her how you do it, how you stay patient, how you wait." I sat with that for a moment. "Tell her to come up next weekend," I said. "I'll teach her how to grow tomatoes. Patience is patience. The vegetable doesn't matter." He laughed. "That's exactly the kind of answer she's going to write down in a notebook somewhere." Good. She should. There are people in this world who will look at what you wear and decide who you are. They'll look at your car, your job, your zip code, your age, the cost of your shoes. They'll construct a version of you from those things and feel comfortable with it because it's simple and simple things are easy to manage. Let them. Because the truth about a person doesn't live in any of those places. It lives in what they've done when nobody was watching. In the work they chose to do quietly, without recognition, without applause. In the things they were willing to give up and the things they were not willing to give up under any circumstances. I wore a frayed jacket to a boardroom on the 42nd floor of a building in downtown Chicago and let a man with a Rolex and a view of the skyline treat me like a problem to be managed. I sat with that for 30 minutes. I've sat with worse for longer. And when the moment came, I put 3 pieces of paper on a table. That was all it took. Not because of the jacket. Not in spite of it. Just because when you do your work right, with patience and precision and the particular kind of stubbornness that my wife always recognized for what it was, the truth doesn't need anything dramatic to make itself known. It just needs someone willing to carry it long enough to set it down in the right place. So here's what I want to ask you. Think about the last time someone underestimated you. The last time someone looked at the surface of your life and decided the story was finished. What did you do with that? What are you still doing with it? Leave a comment. I read every single one. And if you know someone who's been told they don't belong in the room, share this with them. Sometimes the quietest person at the table is the one who's been there the longest.